Hello, sisters. Lesbian Psychologies, Explorations and Challenges. Part 5, Community. Essay number 18. The Saga of Continuing Clash in Lesbian Community, or Will an Army of Ex-Lovers Fail? By Sarah F. Pearlman. The need to belong or feel a part of a particular group is a deeply human urge. For lesbians, it has special importance, for a sense of community helps to establish and maintain lesbian identity, gives one a sense of belonging somewhere, and provides the affirmation and acceptance that is missing in the larger culture. This sense of community helps make bearable the rejection and contempt presented in the larger world. At times, however, the lesbian community is not a haven. Instead of being accepted and supported, lesbians find themselves rejected, alienated, or in conflict with their peers. My interest is the exploration of these conflicts and the ways in which women react when personal feelings are tapped or political differences result in differing points of view. My goal in this chapter is to deepen understanding of the rifts and tensions apparent in many lesbian groups through looking at some of the roots of these conflicts: sociological, political, historical, and psychological. Although I focus on problems in community building, I want to emphasize that lesbians love their lives as lesbians and their women-centered communities with the special pride and joy that is a part of being authentically oneself. Thus, pride, joyfulness, camaraderie, and solidarity are such a part of lesbian communities as are tensions and conflicts. It is also important to note that there is no one history of 20th century American lesbianism. Accounts differ according to one's perceptions, one's experience of events, and the particular community. My own account is based on being part of, and in contact with, a number of lesbian feminist communities since the early 1970s on the East Coast and in one major city in the Midwest. Sociopolitical sources of conflict. The cost of the lesbian choice is high and provides fertile ground for anger and conflict. Invisibility, pretense, and concealment produce stresses and feelings of vulnerability beyond those of people whose relationships and sexual desires are considered normal. Most lesbians live with fear that exposure will lead to loss of jobs and income. Many fear loss of their children through custody awarded to fathers, or through emotional estrangement as their children react to their mother's difference. Few lesbians have the authentic acceptance and affirmation of their family of origin. Some lead half-lives of lies and omissions, hoping that this will maintain some sense of family and home. Still others endure tense and emotionally distant family situations. These losses of acceptability, security, and connection, combined with isolation from both family and the larger culture, create an intense need to experience oneself as part of a larger group, to have a sort of sense of belonging through relationships, alternative families, friendship networks, and social and political organizations. Thus, community as connection provides definition, acceptance, and inclusion. It offers sources for social life, political activity, friendships, lovers, places to go, and other types of assistance. It is these needs that make community profoundly powerful. Lesbian communities are typically defined by geography and composed of groups or networks who are connected through social and political activity. In small towns or universities, there may be a sense of one large community. In larger cities, there may be many communities. The center of community can be one or more bars or coffee houses, a women's center, a social organization, a self-help or discussion groups, or an occasional dance or musical event. Thus, community is not a fixed entity, but rather a sense of connection or quote-unquote groupness, defined and maintained by extended affiliations and frequent or even periodic contact. Community can also be more myth than reality when there is limited contact because of severe estrangements between community members. In fact, the myth of community can itself be a source of conflict. When needs are intense and expectations of a community are high, idealized notions may go beyond what any group of individuals can realistically provide, especially a group that is beleaguered and lacking in resources. Dependency upon community is also heightened by isolation from and discomfort in the larger homophobic culture. The world of a lesbian community is a small one, and compressions, social compressions create a claustrophobic sense of limitation and confinement. No matter how much support and sustenance the community does offer, it cannot replace what has been lost. Thus, members often experience feelings of bitterness and disenchantment over what the community has not and cannot provide, including the experience of quote-unquote normalcy, which exists for those who conform to the values of the dominant culture. Communities also bear the weight of traumas, hurts, and jealousies as breakups and exchanges of lovers create ex-lovers, single lesbians, and new partnerships. Friendships between lesbians are often intense and erotically charged, so that minor disappointments can be experienced as if one friend were rejecting a lover. Tensions can also exist between single and coupled lesbians, and between one's friends and one's lovers, because a relationship often reduces social availability. The wonder of lesbian community is not that problematic conflicts exist, but rather that communities remain cohesive, friendships weather hard times, and ex-lovers become friends. Social events, too, are often joyous occasions characterized by excitement, affection, gaiety, elation, and a wonderful sense of belonging and oneness. However, stresses remain, and an additional burden on lesbian communities is the self-hating of internalized homophobia. If a woman has ambivalent feelings about herself as a lesbian, she may also have ambivalent feelings about the worth of other lesbians. Frustration, rage, and bitterness towards one condition can be turned toward the community of similar inferiorized and powerless others. Certainly, hating other lesbians is safer than turning one's rage against the dominant group, which is less accessible and a great deal more threatening. Such feelings can also provide a sense of the little power any oppressed individual has in the oppressing of someone else as powerless as herself. Thus, within-group conflicts contains and deflects the impulse towards aggressive action inherent in frustration and rage, a convenient dynamic for any dominant group. Another factor that can create conflict is the intense demand for sameness, for a common and collective identity that is typical of many communities. This demand for sameness can clash with the drive toward individual identity, that is, the wish to be one's own person and make independent choices. Susan Krieger describes this demand for sameness as quote-unquote mirroring, that is, the expectation that others will be a mirror image of oneself. This demand for sameness in lesbian communities makes differences uncomfortable and suspect, as is dissimilarity could erode cohesiveness. The contradiction is that lesbians happen to be a remarkably diverse group. What lesbians share, aside from gender, is a decision to act on a preference, the preference to relate both emotionally and sexually to women. All the rest can be differences: race, ethnicity, class, politics, education, work, living styles, bisexual inclination, role identity, differences in sexual/political coming out, sexual behavior, early or late awareness of attraction to women. What is special to lesbians and gay men as an oppressed group is that there is an attempt to create bonding and community without a shared historical and cultural experience, unlike other oppressed groups, blacks or Jews, for example, and in spite of enormous diversity. That both community and lesbian culture have been achieved, including a sense of lesbian history, tradition, and humor, is no small accomplishment. The women's movement added substantially to community cohesiveness in terms of political beliefs and activity. It also drew lines between politicized and non-politicized lesbians and created new arenas for dispute in its initial denial of difference and its insistence on political sameness. Historical political sources of conflict. Before the women's liberation movement, lesbian friendship networks and communities were primarily social and bar-oriented, although there was increasing interest and political activity directed toward attaining civil rights. In pre-movement communities, strict social norms, that is, those based on relationship, dress, and role, butch/femme, had prevailed, with frequent belittling of those lesbians who did not conform. The second wave of feminism added new sources of conflict to what were really new politicized lesbian communities. It also generated a massive coming out of previously heterosexual women. Feminism in the late 60s and early 70s was white, middle class, and composed primarily of heterosexual women with Marxist and New Left backgrounds who were emerging out of civil rights and anti-war activism. The involvement of lesbians quickly increased as the early women's movement offered opportunities for political activism and social change beyond that of the primarily gay male organizations. Feminist political activity gave lesbians places to meet outside of the bars through consciousness-raising groups, women's centers, and services such as rape crisis and other women's health centers. Radical feminist inquiry, in addition, provided lesbians with a means for political analysis and a new revolutionary consciousness of lesbian oppression. Feminism gave lesbianism a female-oriented political movement and a political understanding of the basis of their persecution. The analysis suggested that, for women, the choice to relate emotionally or sexually to women and to make their primary relationships with women is basic to one's freedom. Lesbianism, it was argued, was far from being unnatural, pathological, or sinful. It had been stigmatized and made deliberately taboo through a variety of interconnecting, institutionalized ideologies: religious, psychological, medical, and legal. As lesbians, women move beyond the control of men, at least individual men, sexually, reproductively, emotionally, and as domestic and child care workers. Thus, lesbianism not only means an actual loss to men of women as commodities, but also arouses psychologically primitive fears of exclusion and a loss that may underlie the male compulsion to dominate and control. Because the control of women is basic to patriarchy, heterosexuality must be mandatory and enforced, and lesbianism penalized. Lesbians must be kept invisible, exception pornography. As if they are visible, their choice must be defined as sick and leading to the most tragic of lives. Otherwise, lesbians may suggest to other women what independence and autonomy might look like. Lesbians might also evoke mutinous attraction or hint that women can be nurtured in relationships given the prevalence of emotional deprivation and abuse in heterosexual relationships. The stigma of lesbianism can also be used by the patriarchy to frighten women into subordinate, dependent behaviors through what Shulamith Firestone herself calls the lesbian as buffer. Any woman who seems strong, athletic, competent, and assertive, or who has intense friendships with other women, can always be called a dyke to intimidate her back into the front, into line, and force her to prove femininity and heterosexuality. If feminism gave lesbianism a more revolutionary political movement, lesbians may have returned more, more of a favor than was originally wanted. Less dependent on male affirmation and emotional and economic support than heterosexual women, lesbians were freer to evaluate critically heterosexuality, male behavior, and biological maleness. Lesbians could see that heterosexual relationships were frequently heterosexist, patronizing, and demeaning to women, and there developed a growing sense of weariness and impatience with those heterosexual women who were too quickly rose to the defense of men. Straight feminists began to find lesbians embarrassing, and concern grew that the women's movement would be stigmatized by a lesbian presence. Could the Lavender Menace play in Peoria? In answering the question, the movement split across the gay-straight lines, the first of many splits, and the stage was set for lesbian separatism and the lesbian nation. Women-identified women began to insist that the true revolutionary feminist was a lesbian, that the non-feminist lesbian was unenlightened, and that women could personally and politically develop only in the absence of men. The new lesbian politics declared that lesbians should give energy to lesbians only, should withdraw from relationships with men, including their male children, and from women who continued to relate sexually to men. A new idealized lesbian emerged, and a set of new, remarkably similar rules took hold in politicized communities across the country. This new correctness resembled the old social or role correctness, except that it was now supported and made true by political philosophy. The result was that sameness was politicized. Few white women, straight or lesbian, noticed that feminist analysis did not consider issues relevant to women of color. Women of color had yet to describe their own experience and confront feminism with its inherent racism and classism. Denial of difference also made it difficult to notice that lesbians were not all alike, and that differences along ethnic, class, and educational lines did exist. Leftover prejudices and stereotypes also existed, with perhaps the ingrained cultural habit of generalizing particular experiences to all. These issues, then submerged, led to later confrontations and challenges. Feminism had changed the context for coming out. In the 70s, lesbians came out in an environment in which there was the potential for political support and pride, whereas pre-movement lesbians had come out with little support or notion of pride in communities that emphasized sex and sexual attraction and eroticism often tied to dress and roles. Many of the new, previously heterosexual, radical lesbians had based their choice as much on politics as on sexual interest in other women. These radical lesbian feminists, still reeling perhaps from an oppressive male sexuality, from objectification and unequal and frequently abusive relationships, constructed a less sexual lesbianism. In the highly charged atmosphere of a rape crisis center or a battered women's shelter, it was not difficult to develop a hatred of male physical and sexual aggressiveness. Sexuality became suspect, and along with it, the distinctive eroticism of lesbian culture. A new, correct sexuality became one more source of future differences and antagonism. Thus, feminism beyond the idol of its sisterly beginnings, its idealizations and sense of oneness, began to prescribe a purity of analysis, philosophy, and behaviors. There was now a political right and a political wrong, a correct and an incorrect lesbian feminist line, with trashing and exclusion of those who differed. Yet differences were also emerging. Political divisions of liberal versus radical versus socialist were becoming more apparent and less reconcilable. Assertions and challenges regarding racial, class, and ethnic differences, while creating new comfort and pride based on older and more primary identities, added to community fragmentation. Communities had also increasingly polarized around a variety of issues, including separatism, transsexualism, S&M sexuality, pornography, monogamy, drug and alcohol use, and affiliation with gay male or lesbian feminist groups. While the content or the subject of these particular controversies differed, the reactions and behaviors across communities were remarkably the same. Rigidity and intensity of feelings and opinions, inability to discuss or accept differences, absolute of right and wrong, exclusion and rejection of those who differed. Such characteristics can be signs that more is at stake than is psychologically conscious. And so we turn to the psychological roots of conflict. Psychological sources of conflict in lesbian communities. Quote, "Women together is work. Nothing in civilization has made simple." End quote. There is no question that women have a long history of intense and loving but problematic relationships with each other. Groups in particular are a curious example because they seem to evoke such powerful feelings and reactions. Women join groups, social, political, professional, or therapeutic, for multiple reasons, including wanting to belong somewhere, wishing to meet friends, and wanting to find a lover. If these needs have primacy over the purpose or the goal of the group, disappointment can result in undermining behaviors or departure. In addition, initial group formation stirs feelings and wishes for collective identity or a sense of oneness, so that beginning groups are often charged with magical expectations and unrealistic hopes of what will be experienced and achieved. Any differences that then emerge disturb those wishes and lead to anger and quick disenchantment. Once a group is past the formation stage, a more established, less tentative sense of groupness occurs. At this second stage, issues of power and differences between group members may emerge and become primary, so that meetings and interactions are often filled with unspoken tensions and resentments. Again, different members may depart and some undermining of the group may occur. So unless there is a functioning core of people, group life can be remarkably short. What is especially curious is the struggle within women's groups to ensure the equalization of power as part of a collective process. While the equalizing of power is an important part of feminist theory and practice, the original intention was to ensure that decision making be shared among the group's members, that all members have near equal say or influence, and that male hierarchical structures be avoided. However, what frequently happens is that the collective process becomes primary, while group effectiveness and purpose becomes increasingly secondary and are often willingly sacrificed by group members. Collective process was never intended to disqualify leadership or expertise. However, misuse of process can mask undermining behaviors that serve to level or equalize power, leadership, and expertise in groups of women. Underneath this leveling of struggle are feelings and fears of inadequacy, envy, competitiveness, and anger, evoked by differences in abilities among group members. An unspoken group agreement can be that its members would rather be the same and equal rather than effective. For those women who openly disagree, the outcome is often the decision to leave, or to be expelled. A second curious example involves community controversies and polarizations. What seems important is the intensity, the purism, and the dogmatism of a controversial stand, so that polarizing lines are drawn with extreme judgment and exclusion of those who differ. What becomes primary is the stand, with its accompanying sense of rightness and righteousness, along with the demand for agreement and the personalization of disagreement. What becomes split off and secondary are the consequences or outcomes such as community fragmentation, estrangements, and withdrawal of community members. Also lost in the compulsiveness of the stand are the priorities for concerns as lesbians, women, and people in America of the late 1980s. To help explain these curiosities or dilemmas in the lesbian community, there are a number of women theorists who have looked at the early mother-daughter relationships and its impact on later relationships and behaviors. Many of their ideas are being extended to lesbian relationships on issues such as fusion, dependency, power, nurturance, sexuality, and difficulty with differences and separateness. See Beverly Birch, Margaret Nichols, and Sue Vargo in this volume. Their theoretical speculations may also have relevance in understanding the conflicts among extended relationships, that is, the lesbian community. The first of these theorists, Dorothy Dinnerstein, describes how power or authority in women is problematic for both women and men, in that it evokes feelings and fears connected with our earliest experiences with an all-powerful mother. It was this woman who had the power to love and gratify, or to deprive and hurt, at a time of our most extreme helplessness and dependency, during infancy and childhood. It was this woman who was the first person to whom we all, as infants and children, first submitted. She, too, was the first person against whom we rebelled and thus began our beginning assertion of individuality. These interactions took place also before language and thought, and thus the ability to articulate feelings. This gives later adult feelings that may be connected to these infant feelings and interactions a wordless power and intensity unaffected by the modifying impact of language. To Dinnerstein, female power is associated and connected with danger. Women do fear power, both in themselves and in other women. Women fear power in other women because it evokes their own feelings of inadequacy, envy, and anger. Women fear power in themselves, in part, due to fears of alienating or losing others. Ruth Moulton attempts to explain these particular feelings as being based in maternal ambivalence, envy, and competitiveness toward daughters' independence and achievement. To the extent that one's mother competed, envied, and discouraged achievement, overtly or disguised, the daughter will later avoid competition, will fear envy and disapproval, and will feel vulnerable to angry retaliation on the part of other women. Differences can also be experienced as unequalizing or power differences. Birch, in her therapy work with lesbian couples, described in this volume, has observed that differences between two women are often looked at as a problem of inequity, and that one's sense of powerlessness in relation to another woman seems to be experienced as unbearable. The theories of Nancy Trotterow have begun to have enormous influence on the deciphering of conflicts and difficulties in lesbian relationships. Trotterow states that women share an experience of being mothered by a same-sex parent who typically believes and expects a high degree of sameness and responsivity in daughters, with resulting confusion around identity and boundaries. Differences and moves towards independence and autonomy are then often experienced by mother as rejection, betrayal, and denial of their own worth based on their life choices, and they react in turn with rejection and emotional withdrawal. Independence and difference can also be perceived as threatening to mothers who have built a half-conscious security around the notion of eventual dependence on daughters. While this blurring of self and other enhances the qualities of empathy, nurturance, and ability for intimacy in adult women, a typical growing up experience for women has been that sameness and responsivity to others is reinforced, while autonomy, separateness, and differences are discouraged. Separateness and difference then become associated with rejection, withdrawal, threat to emotional safety, and possible relationship loss that continue into adult life and adult relationships. Certainly, this is part of the problematic fusion so many lesbian couples experience. An additional fact is that by becoming quote unquote different as lesbians, women do lose their relationship with their mothers. Another theorist, Jane Flax, speculates that women are raised by mothers who are more intensely conflicted in their relationships to daughters compared to sons. She points out that mothers carry a damaged sense of personal worth because of female inferiority under patriarchy, and may be devaluing of daughters as well as homophobic regarding physical contact. Flax believes, too, that mothers may be less responsive to daughters' needs because the needs of daughters can evoke memory or recognition of their own unmet needs in relation to their mothers as well as to male partners in adult life. This conflicted responsivity can leave daughters with a sense of inadequate nurturance, and means that women as adults may tend to seek emotional separation in later relationships to make up for the bonding and closeness not received from mothers. This sense of inadequate nurturance may explain the intensity of relationships with women, and Flax emphasizes that unresolved longings for one's mother, quote, fill intimate female relationships with extraordinary power to damage and gratify, end quote. In addition, female devaluation, lack of nurturance, and a socialization that continuously discourages competence and mastery leaves women with a wounded or flawed sense of self. This impedes healthy competition and taking risks and creates the tendency to compare oneself unfavorably, to feel others have attributes one cannot attain, and to relinquish trying and withdraw. It also contributes to protective behaviors that defend against all possible criticism and feelings of inadequacy or wrongness. This, too, makes argument and difference difficult. Flax also suggests that the idol of the early women's movement, applicable to lesbian community, may have aroused feelings and longings for oneness, sameness, nurture, and belonging that never could have been fulfilled. When the fantasy of oneness is disturbed through recognition of difference, leftover feelings of rage and betrayal from the early mother-daughter relationship can be evoked. To Flax, the women's movement has never fully recovered from the discovery of differences, nor have lesbian communities. To this notion of betrayal and anger, Artemis March adds her suggestion that the original betrayal in the mother-daughter relationship may be the heterosexual mother's preference for a mate of a different sex. Karen Feit and Nicola Trumbo extend this issue of maternal betrayal by describing common experiences of mothers' inaccessibility because of sickness, depression, and alcoholism, mothers' subservience to fathers, preference towards sons, and keeping daughters in homes characterized by paternal physical, sexual, and verbal abuse. Dorothy Dinnerstein also suggests that women may have difficulty with same-sex solidarity because of two developmental factors or experiences. One is that although boys achieve independence from mothers, in part through identification with fathers and establishing solidarity with men, women lack this particular developmental experience. Daughters, instead, struggle with independence from the same-sex parent, so that same-sex solidarity has no part in assisting with autonomy. The second developmental factor is that when daughters do attempt more independence from their mothers, they may utilize idolizing fathers and devaluing mothers, a kind of splitting, so that father gets assigned the goods and mother the bad, congruent with social devaluing. Dinnerstein suggests that for women to achieve solidarity with other women, splitting must be tempered, and ambivalence and mixed feelings must be able to be tolerated. A last point is the observation that women tend to be extremely dyadic in terms of relationship patterns. Most women can readily recall experiencing or being part of exclusionary interactions as children or adolescents, that is, where one girl or another is excluded or expelled from a clique or a threesome, thereby reducing it to a twosome. Feit and Trumbo speculate that these exclusionary behaviors may be rooted in the dyadic socialization common to women, the original mother-daughter pair, as well as expression of anger toward one's mother, along with an attempt to feel powerful, included, special, and loved through the rejection of another. Whatever the psychological source, it is as if some old powerful psychological drama based on dyadic bonding, exclusion, and one person's holding of all of the bad is being reenacted. From these observations and speculations, we can perhaps begin to construct a theory to account for the conflictual aspects of relationships between women based on fear of female power and female difference, and the splitting and betraying aspects of the mother-daughter relationship, and to build an interconnected group of ideas that can explain what seems to be a rage in waiting between women and a too-ready hypercriticalness, an immediate reaction to disappointment or difference perceived as betrayal or abandonment, and a response reflex to be placed or displaced on other women. Crucial also is that these speculations not place blame or attribute total or personal outcomes to mothers, a too painfully familiar assumption within traditional psychology. Whoever has the role of first and primary caretaker must have profound impact. However, it is important to remember that mothers do mother under incredibly debilitating circumstances, including overwork, exhaustion, poverty, emotional deprivation, and abuse. The idea is perhaps neither to idolize nor condemn, but to recognize the endurance and strength that go into mothering, to understand the personal limitations of one's mother, and that she too had been socialized under patriarchy and is a victim of it. New challenges. The theories I have discussed primarily describe pre-verbal experience and the psychological unconscious. It is questionable what one can do about pre-verbal interactions and the unconscious, except perhaps to speculate about it consciously and become aware of one's own personal behaviors as signs that more than what is conscious may be in operation. What does seem important to consider is that there may be some early psychological confusion around sameness and closeness, and separateness, difference, and rejection. There may also be unresolved feelings connected to women, such as fear of authority, power, and dependency, a vulnerability to experiencing certain actions as betrayal, and a susceptibility to feelings of rage when those actions or interactions involve another woman. In addition, events during early life and the position of women in society can lead to a sense of self as flawed that makes self protection paramount. This affects relationships and behaviors, and can further result in treating women who disagree or disappoint, or choose to think differently, as if they were indeed an abandoning or a betraying ex lover. Equally important are the multiple social reasons for antagonism between women, such as which encumber relationship and solidarity, and prevent the formation of a full social movement. These reasons relate to oppression as women and as lesbians, the dynamics within lesbian communities, the diversity of lesbians, particularly class and economic differences, and living in a fairly stressful society. In actuality, we live in an extremely destructive and pathological society that makes both living and keeping down personal neuroticism a struggle. The politicization of lesbian consciousness was an extraordinary gift. The politicization of sameness was less of a gift, and instead forced polarization and a political purism that ignored diversity, personal timing, and the right to individual choice. Concealed under that purism are also those who behave irresponsibly and unthinkingly in terms of a common or community good, who waste time on the detail and lose sight of the whole, and who act out the personal under the political. The result is that the true enemy is forgotten as enemies are made of one another. As the persecution of lesbians increases, as poverty among women accelerates, as abortion remains under threat, and custody of children is jeopardized, some reordering of priorities and some hard looks at self may be necessary. There is some responsibility here. Lesbians do need each other, but not as desperately at this time. The reality is that although consensus may be impossible, it is through differences that we learn from each other. Conversely, conviction and the unwavering stand also jar thought, stir imagination, and create new passions crucial to maintaining vitality in any movement. What remains unfortunate is that lesbian community what remains unfortunate What remains unfortunate is that lesbian communities lack a tradition of those mediating forms or structures that contain and resolve community tensions and conflicts. Until such forms exist, responsibility must remain personal instead of collective.